Elena, we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with our fintech ethics and risk students. Um, we've known each other a fair bit of time now, but just for our students who are from over 160 countries, thousands of them around the world, could you just give us a brief background about yourself and the work that you're doing now?
Sure. Thanks for having me, David. It's such an honor to be
Mhm.
on this show, I guess, on this clip for so many students from around the world. I'm actually from around the world too. I am from Malaysia originally, and I am currently living in Washington, D.C. I work for a small think tank called the Asia Society Policy Institute, where I focus on tech governance issues. I do a bit of work on countering violent extremism because that's what I started my think tank career doing. But mainly now I focus on kind of the big public policy governance issues related to technology, including cybersecurity, but also evolving technology like AI.
Well, from your own, I guess, personal journey, because I know you've done a lot of interesting things. You've got a very diverse academic and professional background. But how did you get interested in this idea of governance and technology and cyber risk and kind of the landscape that you're working in right now?
So my educational background was in law, and I really wanted to be a public international lawyer. But my main area of focus when I was at law school was in public international law, and I
Mm,
was always drawn to the idea of global governance and how states interact with each other. I went into the think tank world instead because I was trying to find my way and realized that the think tank world was really my spirit world, and I really enjoyed the intellectual independence and autonomy and kind of the stimulating discussions that we usually have in some of these discussion circles. I really started thinking about technology maybe about 15 years ago or so, but I really started wondering about how international law and things like norms, principles, values were going to figure into this emerging domain in cyberspace. And so that's when I really started paying attention to some of the conversations happening at the UN, for example, around norms of responsible state behavior and the more contentious issues of how international law would or would not apply in cyberspace. And so that's where I am today. But obviously, technology keeps evolving. And now we're talking about things like ethics and principles as they apply or not to things like AI.
I know you mentioned before we started recording that you're working on a really interesting project at the moment related to kind of the ethics of artificial intelligence. If you don't mind, maybe you can just talk briefly to that, just because I'm sure many of our students would be interested, because that's certainly one big area that we're exploring in our course as well.
So I am indeed trying to wrap up as of now when we're recording this, a project related specifically to Southeast Asia. We're focusing on 5 countries in Southeast Asia: Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore, looking at two major issues in tech as it relates to the region. So one has to do with ethics and AI, and the other has to do with data. And obviously the two overlap and intersect with each other. But for research purposes, because they're such huge topics, as you know, on their own, we're treating them separately. And we're going to marry them up into what we're calling a policy playbook, which is essentially
Mm,
recommendations for governments and even non-government stakeholders. The idea sort of came about because there, as you know, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of exuberance in the region about all things tech. And unfortunately, not to what I've seen, not very much discussion about the underpinnings of tech as they apply in Southeast Asia. So what do ethics mean in an ethnically or religiously or linguistically diverse country like Indonesia or like Malaysia, for example? How are data sets being collected? Where are they being sent to be trained for AI algorithms? How are these AI systems or platforms being operated and applied in local contexts? And do they actually
mm.
serve the purposes of these local communities if they're not speaking the language or serving the needs of the population themselves? So these are kind of some of the questions that we're trying to explore.
Oh, that's fascinating, and I think some of our students will know because many of them are from Southeast Asia or Asia in general. But obviously, Southeast Asia is gone through a huge kind of evolution of how technology has penetrated, kind of at least in the consumer space. As a result of that, that's generating, like you mentioned, a lot of data that is then being used by institutions and organizations. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and it's probably very similar to challenges that a lot of other places are facing in the world or will face as they go through a similar growth cycle. So in your work, you talked about this idea of norms, which, for those of us that have at least studied a little bit of international law, that's a very common, kind of perception about norms and standards and things like that. How have you felt like these norms evolve? Because one thing we talk about in the course is this basic idea that technology will always be ahead of regulation and law. And as a result of that, tech innovators themselves may have to self regulate to a certain extent in certain situations. When you think about these ideas of norms, I'm just curious how you envision these norms being applied either to private tech companies or to nation states or any type of entity in between.
Yes, I mean, you and some of your students may have heard of this process called the UN Group of Governmental Experts. And there is one that's dedicated to norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And these are 11 norms that were agreed to upon by everybody at the UNGA in 2015. It's basically just good faith relations between countries, that one country won't attack or stage an attack through another country against another. So I've had the privilege of being involved in kind of capacity building training for Southeast Asian states on behalf of the UN. And in trying to unpack what these norms mean in practice for states like Southeast Asia that may see it as an abstract, but don't really comprehend right now, at least, how it applies to daily life. A few of us really started digging into kind of the history of the region. And we found that a lot of these norms have actually long been established, maybe not in the technological space per se, but things like ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. That also relates to the norms of responsible state behavior. So these norms have actually long been there. They've evolved, obviously, with technology, as you said, but sometimes, these can be adapted to the innovations and trends that are beginning to slowly evolve and emerge in the tech space.
So thanks for that background and perspective. In the work that you're doing to the think tank world, looking at extremism and terrorism and security threats, right now, what's your view of cyber risk? What are the risks that perhaps companies face, nation states face? I'm just curious what your perspective is on those kind of areas.
So the risks are not new. They are just in a different form right now, and they're magnified and they're amplified in different ways. And I think what we're seeing right now, all this debate, we're recording this a few days after Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter, what it means for free speech versus moderation of hate speech, for example, in some countries. So there's a whole bucket of issues dealing with online content and how that affects the offline world that is really starting to become a lot more robust in discussion because of the real world effects that we're seeing in places like the United States, but also in Myanmar and India, where there's actual violence, physical violence that is catalyzed by these sometimes very hateful comments on cyberspace. Just as an aside, one of the former UN Commissions of Human Rights, he had said something in a closed-door discussion which stuck with me ever since. And he said, the US's First Amendment standard of freedom of speech cannot be the standard for the rest of the world. And I think the consequences of that we're seeing in very diverse countries like the ones that I mentioned. So you have these tech companies that are headquartered in the US or operate from the US. What do their standards mean for the rest of the world as applied to the very different contexts in each of these countries?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I think we see that a lot when we think about these norms that you mentioned. Obviously a lot of like international law norms, what we consider like kind of this idea of the basic freedoms, those norms. A lot of that emanates from kind of what the political and social history of what the West went through. And that's not to say that they're incorrect or not correct. It's just that's what it is, right? We're just objectively stating that. And then I think it's very interesting that point, I guess that just that reference you made about how that gets then interpreted or applied in a different cultural context, different historical context, different social context, and what that implies. With respect to this idea of platforms and speech, you have studied terrorism and extremism, before you jumped into technology. So you kind of can see it very clearly, like kind of both worlds. And so, I'm curious what your thoughts are when people do say, hey, if you kick people off certain platforms, you're like limiting their speech. Either the platform doing it, or they have, the government's doing it, or whoever's doing it. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
There is no easy answer because in countries like Sri Lanka, which have had an unfortunate history of violence and conflicts for decades, free speech can be very inflammatory, and the
Mm,
slightest spark can really spark real violence. You see this in parts of India as well. I don't know where the answer is, and I don't think there is an easy one because there is value, of course, to preserving free speech. Who gets to decide who speaks or not
mm,
on these platforms is obviously a key question. I mean, personally, I'm of the mind that there cannot be complete free and open speech without responsibility.
sure.
And this might be where self-regulation, as you mentioned, by companies come in concert with governments that are supposed to understand their local context. But then there's always the real risk of, unfortunately and inadvertently, strengthening authoritarian tendencies in some places. So these are all hard questions. So I'm sure your students will figure them out and make better decisions than have been made already.
Well, we hope so, and this is why we do the course, so we can think about these questions. As a related note, one thing I heard recently, given in the context of U.S. Law as relates to speech, but I think the general gist of it was, sure, there's freedom of speech that's a right within the Constitution of the United States, but there's no provision of a freedom of amplification of that speech. So people can say it, whatever it may be, within whatever the legal grounds are at that particular moment. But there's no right to be able, that you have to, the right to amplify that speech. Is the way I heard it described. I thought that was interesting. I think that's a very interesting kind of way to think about, at least in the context of the United States. If we kind of go back to cybersecurity for a second, do you feel like cybersecurity risk is increasing? And in the sense of, certainly there's more threat actors out there, or at least we're more aware of them. But part of the other side of the equation is, are we more prepared for that in terms of organizations, nation states, institutions? From your view of that, like how does that cybersecurity landscape look at this moment compared to perhaps maybe how it was?
I mean, as you mentioned, there's more awareness, but then technology always outpaces that level of awareness, right? And so the threats are getting more sophisticated. And so the level of risk out there is obviously a lot higher than it was before. Unfortunately, there are many populations in different parts of the world that are not even up to basic cyber hygiene. Things like only now are we beginning to talk about multi-factor authentication or
Mm,
one-time passwords. Um, and these are fairly new developments, as you know so well, even in the fintech space. There are all these risks that are starting to crop up that companies are only starting to become more aware of. And obviously, for smaller companies trying to enter this space, and in Southeast Asia, 97% of enterprises are MSMEs. And so
mhm,
for these smaller companies to even get their foot in the door to sell their stuff online, the cost of ensuring that their businesses, that their customers are protected from cyber risk is like so much higher, right, than it would be for huge companies already in that space. And I see really interesting developments in places like Japan, where you have big conglomerates trying to help out with the capacity building of smaller companies and trying to show them and share tools with them in order for them to protect their businesses, but also to protect their customers. And so I think these are really encouraging signs. But at the same time, there is also just a lot of work to do at the user level, at the individual user level, and in trying to alleviate some of the business costs for so many of these MSMEs, including the female entrepreneurs trying to
mm.
muscle their way through a sometimes male dominated space.